don't know how powerful your voice is. They don't want to hear another legislator. They don't want to hear somebody else that's advocating. Sometimes they just want to hear that personal story.
The only way to stop asbestos-related cancers is to ban it.
About 40,000 Americans die every year of asbestos-caused diseases.
So next, we have Rebel with a Cause. Dr. Castleman, can you please come forward? So Barry is beyond an expert. His knowledge is deep. He is such a wonderful human. When it comes to asbestos advocacy, Barry is so genuine and committed. You are astounding, and it's an honor to call you my friend, and I know I can always count on you. So you're going to hear Barry talk about how the evidence is used possibly in the law, I suspect. And Barry, welcome to the podium.
Thanks.
Yeah, love you.
I'm going to try to talk about kind of the big picture of public health struggle over asbestos. Looking back since I first got involved in this, I started reading about the hazards of asbestos in 1970. I was being trained in air pollution control. That was at a time when the United States government was more functional. They had created fellowships to train people in air pollution control even before they created the Environmental Protection Agency. And so I started reading about the health effects of pollutants because I was just an engineer, didn't know anything about public health. And when I came across asbestos, I was just dumbfounded because I soon found the Selikoff proceedings from the 1964 conference and documenting the appalling risks associated with it, even to members of the households of the workers and the neighbors of the asbestos air pollution point sources getting mesothelioma. So this meant that millions of workers were at risk, and their family members and all the people that lived around all these shipyards and construction sites. It was most of the population was at risk of getting this dreadful, these dreadful cancers. And but still, the use of asbestos kept going up. In 1970, I found it had kept going up after this conference had been held. And this was because there was no regulation. There was little in the way of information. Dr. Selikoff was doing a heroic job of reaching out to the media in a way that practically no one else could. He had a kind of a fluency, a way of answering questions. Journalists would say things like, well, the asbestos industry says this is a big emotional thing, this thing about asbestos. And Selikoff leaned back and said, well, most forms of cancer we don't know how to prevent, but there are some that we do. And I get emotional about cancer that could be prevented that doesn't get prevented. That was his way of, he always had a great answer for the media. And none of this I'll get back to you tomorrow stuff. Anyway, with Selikoff and environmental groups like the Natural Resources Defense Council, things got turned around finally in 1973. The use of asbestos in the U.S. peaked and started going down. And so we were starting to make some progress. It went down by half from 1973 till the end of the 1970s, and then plunged after that. Meanwhile, personal injury litigation in the United States rose from hundreds of cases to thousands in the late 1970s, and through the power of legal discovery, lawyers representing asbestos victims laid bare a history of toxic corporate crime, there for all to see in the words of the perpetrators. And the liability thus established ended the use of asbestos in the United States despite the courts overturning the EPA ban. It really was the only country in the world where liability got rid of the entire use of asbestos in production of products in the country. In the rest of the world, the costs of asbestos have been borne almost entirely by the victims and the National Health Services, without any disclosure of how big companies made fortunes selling asbestos. The companies walked away practically without any liability for the cover-up, without responsibility for the sale of products that are still killing people every day and still endangering millions of people's lives. The European companies avoided having their managers and doctors have to testify about what they knew and did, and they avoided revealing damning documents about how they sold asbestos and covered up what they did. Sometimes the evidence unearthed in discovery here is enough to support cases against employers. Workers' compensation laws passed in the between 1910 and 1920 were passed for the purpose of limiting, of preventing workers from suing their employers for getting occupational injuries and disease. And that was the whole, and all of these workers' comp laws were supported by business interests and conservative governments. But in Pennsylvania, plaintiffs' lawyers were able to convince the courts that because of the short statute of limitations in the workers' compensation law doesn't apply to asbestos-related disease, and so employees have been able to sue employers in Pennsylvania in the last few years for asbestos conditions. There are other cases where the workers' compensation law can be pushed aside as a limit if the liability evidence against the company is so damning that the court allows that the worker can sue the employer. And this has happened in the case of Alcoa in Missouri and Rogers Corporation in Connecticut, where the courts presented with the evidence of the horrible conditions in the plant documented in the corporate documents have said, yes, you can take this to a jury without the limits of a workers' compensation law in terms of recovery. Decades of litigation and discovery of corporate documents have unearthed a veritable encyclopedia of toxic corporate crime. Hundreds of companies have been subject to legal discovery through over the last 40 years. And the kinds of things that have come up have included suppression of medical and experimental findings, statements by industry trade associations that asbestos products are not toxic, prolonged violation of regulations requiring warning labels on asbestos products. So there were two periods. There was before government regulation and then after the 1970s with government regulation starting to happen. And so the corporate documents show the cover-up in the beginning and then the reaction when they were on the back foot, fighting regulation and newspaper inquiries and things like that, and workers and unions raising protests. Other examples of things that were shown in the corporate documents were suppression of positive medical findings when they chest x-rayed their workers and didn't tell them they had asbestosis. Some of these companies firing workers and busting unions for protesting asbestos hazards. That was Westinghouse, for one. Exporting banned asbestos products, labeling asbestos-containing products asbestos-free, subcontracting hazardous asbestos work by major corporations. Alcoa and Reynolds Aluminum come to mind, and Westinghouse. And just the total failure to have any sanitary precautions to keep workers from walking home with the dust on their clothes and endangering their families. This is one of the most extreme crimes of industry, and not just provide them with some showers and separate lockers. You don't even have to tell them this stuff can kill them. Just say, clean up on your way home. We'll provide you with the work clothes and wash them here at the plant. You don't have to take that home. Renowned New Yorker journalist Paul Brodeur called it a 50-year history of corporate malfeasance and inhumanity to man unparalleled in the annals of the private enterprise system. This was his conclusion in his third book on asbestos, Outrageous Misconduct, the Asbestos Industry on Trial. As a public health scientist in the 1970s, working with environmental groups, I encountered some people like the new lobbyist for Johns Manville in 1974. He invited me to an expensive French restaurant across the street from his lobbying office, which I could have never afforded to go to, and spent the entire lunch insulting me, saying that I was just, saying terrible things about the asbestos companies and just trying to give them bad publicity because I hated corporations. Not that there was any problem with asbestos. That same year, Johns Manville hired Paul Coton, the first director of the National Institute for Environmental Health Sciences, as a vice president for health and safety, and they would send him in to oppose asbestos regulations at the EPA and the Consumer Product Safety Commission and OSHA. And Coton would also testify that back in the day, people didn't know asbestos was dangerous, so he was even helping them in damage suits brought by their former employees and workers who used their products. As a local health official in Baltimore in 1972, I sent warnings out to break-in muffler shops and new and used car dealers, warning them not to take compressed air hoses to blow out brake assemblies. This was just before any of the brake manufacturers or auto companies were putting any warning labels, which were by then required by OSHA, on their products. 3 years later, NIOSH issued a detailed warning about the dangers of brake and clutch repair and said there were 900,000 people in the country who were working as mechanics who were at serious risk. And then the EPA published something called the Gold Book, which was a pamphlet for people to understand about the dangers of doing brake repair. About 2 million brake repairs are done by people on their own cars and trucks every year. And then in 2003, a law firm called Morgan Lewis, with undisclosed clients, including General Motors and Chrysler, pressed the EPA to withdraw the Gold Book, claiming that newly published articles by mercenary scientists hired by General Motors, Chrysler, and other companies showed that the asbestos exposure of mechanics wasn't causing asbestos disease after all, and they could withdraw this warning booklet, which was being used in the courts against the same companies. And we had quite a fight on our hands. Richard Lemon published an article detailing many reports of mesotheliomas in mechanics that had been published. Dr. David Eagleman submitted discovered corporate documents showing that the companies were measuring the exposures associated with the brake repair work and acknowledging the dangers in their own internal documents. And with the determination of dedicated public servants in the government, in the EPA and OSHA, EPA and OSHA did reaffirm the hazards of brake repair in documents they published in 2006 and 2007. And it was the brakes were the thing that kept back the idea of banning asbestos. And it was the Swedes that forced Saab, Scania, and Volvo to come up with brakes that didn't include asbestos for new cars and for replacement brakes. And once they were able to do that in Sweden, it soon spread to the rest of Europe. And by the end of the 1990s, bans on asbestos were going on all across. All the major companies in Europe had bans on asbestos in the 1990s. And that forced all the automakers, including the Americans and the Japanese automakers, to make asbestos-free cars so they could sell in the European market. Turning to criminality, criminal prosecution of the Swiss asbestos billionaire Stefan Schmidheiny in Italy was practically unique in holding an asbestos industry executive and owner personally responsible for business decisions that doomed so many people's lives. In between 2018 and 2023, Schmidheiny was tried in 3 courts in Italy and convicted in each one and sentenced to jail time in each of these 3 cases, and they are now working their way up and being appealed by Schmidheiny's lawyers. Schmidheiny is a multi-billionaire asbestos magnate. Criminality on the national scale has been conducted by the Russians. Russian and Kazakh owners sending the spy to spy on asbestos activists in Asia in particular, and us, between 2012 and 2016. Russia has used trade measures to oppose asbestos bans in Thailand. And in Sri Lanka, they claimed that tea that was an important export of Sri Lanka to Russia had insect fragments in it one year when the Sri Lankans were talking about banning asbestos. And those things were connected. Russian asbestos interests bought into companies making asbestos roofing sheets in Vietnam and then formed a trade association to lobby against banning asbestos in Vietnam. This was too much for the Communist Party, which called in the press and said, don't publish anything the trade association says. So we've got 250,000 people dying each year from past and continuing asbestos use in the world. And I just wanted to say that most of this is in Asia. We're still using 1 million, about 1/5 of the total at the world peak in the mid-70s of 5 million tons a year. And the Australian Asbestos and Silica Safety and Eradication Agency, an agency set up under pressure from the Australian unions, has been going around to many of the Asian countries still using asbestos and raising awareness of the local communities and civil society to try and start to bring about public health progress there. I just want to conclude that we need to ban asbestos in the United States. We need to support the Alan Reinstein Ban Asbestos Now Act and get that passed so that we can catch up to Croatia and the other 68 countries that have banned asbestos.
Thank you, Barry.